The Assault on Castrum Velx. Welcome, gentle listener, I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and frays of the Warhammer 30k universe. The Age of Darkness. And today, we shall be hearing about a brand new scrap brought to us from the Horus Heresy. A little tale of the siege of Castrum Velx. Of course, this is because of the attached rules covering the Blood Angels' most elite force, the Sanguinary Guard. Now I have to admit that I have not started my Horus Heresy Blood Angels army yet, relying on my sons of Perturabo, as my nose was out of joint something fierce when I heard that there were no unit statistics for the Guardians of the Great Angel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, Sanguinius himself. And I found this a horrific shock, as where else would you expect to find the most pertinent rules and representation of this unit, if not in the Horus Heresy, where they were around their lord every minute of every day. But now we have said details, I feel a BA army coming on. Oh yes, I do. Because I can transfer so many of my old firstborn to that force. They need not go unloved. I shall bring them to the wars of the 31st millennium instead. And so, let us hear of the assault of Castrum Velx, where not only the Sanguinary Guard, but also the Angels' Tears are mentioned. A topic I shall circle around to in the very near future. And so, as usual, to quote, exemplary battles of the Age of Darkness. Assault on Castrum Velx. As the Age of Darkness ground ever onwards, the fires of war would spread throughout the entire galaxy, consuming everything in their path. Armies and worlds were reduced to nothing more than ash, in many cases leaving no one alive to bear witness to the sacrifices made or the atrocities committed. During this time, each legion employed unique formations to prosecute their own style of war, whether by choice or through necessity, making use of unconventional, often abhorrent tactics and weapons. Many of these formations would be lost during the dark years following the Horus Heresy, their traditions wiped out and the last stockpiles of their weapons exhausted. Some, however, have been preserved in these records, that future generations may learn of the terrors unleashed upon the galaxy by the Emperor's turncoat sons and the valiant heroes who stood against them. In late 010, Millennium 31, the Blood Angels Legion, the 9th, came to Talassar, led by Judicia Aster Crone. The sons of Sanguinius followed the decree of Guilliman and orders of their Primarch, one fleet amongst many who sought to acquire a panacea for the Ultramarines Legion's losses. They descended upon Talassar in full combat drop, 9 gunships and a dozen Xiphons breaking through the planet's rain-heavy atmosphere, carrying 150 legionaries gathered from the orphaned remnants of companies that had merged from the carnage of Cygnus. The flight of aircraft swept across the grasslands of Talassar, then over siege lines constructed on the outskirts of Velx City. There, basilisk tanks of the 209th Gilded Sentinels Solar Auxiliary Cohort, deployed in advance of the Legion's assault, had begun to unleash their fury upon the distant fortress of Castrum Velx, a relentless rain of shells hammering into the shields of the bastion. Clusters of red figures stood guard around the grey and gold of the 209th Artillery, a 100-strong Blood Angels reserve deployed as a firebreak against the battle that raged deeper in Velx City. The flight of Blood Angels aircraft moved onwards into the smoke-filled skies above the city streets, passing over the embattled 246th Luminous Host Solar Auxiliary Cohort, bound to the 9th Legion by ancestral bonds and sworn oaths, and the ruins of buildings that had stood tall only hours before. The Auxilia fought those of Talassar who had betrayed their oaths to Emperor and Imperium, militia once loyal to Ultramar, who now proclaimed the Night Lords, the Eighth, as their masters. Their new patrons stalked the fringes of combat, packs of midnight-clad legionaries descending to seize victims and drag them into the shadows, the screams of the unfortunate, amplified by vox networks to ring out louder than the roar of battle itself. Intent upon assaulting Castrum Velx, Crone ignored requests for aid from the 246th and words of caution offered by Cafziel, a seraph of the Sanguinary Guard, first amongst the 7 who had been tasked with accompanying the Judicia and now stood with the Blood Angels' rear elements. Records indicate that during the invasion's planning, Cafziel had espoused a slow push into Velx City, followed by the besieging of its fortress, now a den of Night Lords who had seized Talassar as their own. Crone's assault had disregarded such advice and did so again, for the Judicia was a commander of bloody-minded tenacity. The fortress held the prize he had been sent for, and so the fortress was his target. Before taking to his gunship, Crone's final words were that if the Ceres wished to delay, they would stand vigilant against assaults upon the Auxilia rearguard until such time as war had need of them. Castrum Velx stood atop a promontory on the coast of Velx City, the shadow of its armored walls and keep looming over the surrounding city. Walls that had stood for centuries were now pockmarked with craters where artillery shells had struck, and burning gun batteries atop the parapets marked places where the shield aegis had faltered. Yet the defences of Castrum Velx had not been fully cast down, and the report of artillery fire was joined by the thundering booms of anti-aircraft guns as the Blood Angels neared. Tracer rounds and flak fire filled the air, a deadly storm of munitions that tore aircraft from the skies, raining flaming debris down upon traitor positions within the city streets. Crone knew not if any passengers had survived the crashes, for the closer they came to Castrum Velx, interference escalated across the Vox network, crackling static laced with the echoes of his own words and whispered chants alternating between Low Gothic and Nostraman. Lan Sahai, the chants said. He who had snared them, he who awaited them, he who would flay them. Crone's own Thunderhawk would not survive the fury directed against it, one wing shorn off by a lancing beam of light, and the pilot fighting to angle the plummeting aircraft towards the fortress, in a final effort to land beyond the wall. The gunship fell short, slamming into the causeway that wound its way upwards through the rock face of the promontory, coming to rest 50 meters down from the fortress gate. Crone emerged from the wreckage of his Thunderhawk to see the ruins of his strike force scattered on the approach to the fortress, the full complement of his gunships having been struck from the sky to crash upon the cliff face and the city streets around it. Legionaries were punched from their feet as they sought cover, those too slow torn apart by the hail of bolter fire unleashed by Night Lords atop the distant parapets. Others fell to the shrapnel and rock fragments that sighed through the air as heavy defense guns bombarded the Blood Angels and Rockface. No call for aid could be issued, for the Vox networks were overwhelmed by the traitors' interference shroud. The sole cover for Crone and his warriors was the smouldering debris of their aircraft, scant defense against the guns of the traitors. Into the storm. To advance meant almost certain death for Crone and his warriors, barely 40 in number. To remain was to be picked apart, and to withdraw down the causeway was to accept defeat and still expose themselves to the enemy guns. Seeing no alternative save the slimmest hope of victory, Crone rose from his position behind the crumbled cockpit of his Thunderhawk, enemy fire ricocheting from his power field and armor. The Judicia raised his shard axe and shouted an order, his words drowned out by the roar of guns around him. Crone charged up the stone causeway, eyes fixed upon the gatehouse at its end. Behind him, his warriors saw their Judicia rise and joined the charge. As Crone and his warriors moved upwards, the air about them was rent by the wall guns of Castrum Velx, anti-air batteries tracking not the ground troops but incoming aircraft. A new flight of Thunderhawks and Storm Eagles vectoring towards the fortress. At their fore came an armoured behemoth, a Sokar-patterned stormbird, its wings trimmed with finery of gold and the winged mask of the Sanguinary Guard emblazoned upon its fuselage. A halo of light surrounded the stormbird, its void shields flaring as they absorbed and deflected the fire turned upon it, the defences ignoring those behind it as they sought to bring down the vast gunship. Missiles and las cannon beams spat forth from the stormbird in answer, a dozen gun batteries reduced to fire and broken metal. Gunships dived in to land at the promontory's base, but the stormbird carried on, streaking over the Blood Angels charging upwards, the causeway already littered with the corpses of a dozen red-armored legionaries. Overhead, the rear door of the stormbird opened, and from it plummeted a towering form. Stone cracked as Hamonar crashed into the causeway, the dreadnought-bound warrior standing tall before Crone and his handful of warriors. The Contemptor's assault cannon opened fire upon the wall, suppressing the Night Lords on it and shredding those who did not seek cover fast enough. With thundering steps, Hamonar led the charge towards the gatehouse, his armoured form a bulwark which drew the ire of the fortress's defenders. The Stormbird had carried onwards, passing over the gatehouse as its void shields strained with bright light under the deadly attentions of the bastion's anti-air guns. From this shining glare emerged golden figures. They descended upon the wall and its defenders, Cafsiel landing first, his spear piercing clean through the eyelens of a traitor before his foot touched stone. As the Night Lord's legionary toppled, Cafsiel pulled his spear free, a blow from its shaft pitching a traitor over the wall, then a thrust impaling another legionary, as the Serap's perdition weapon blazed into life, consuming its target in flame. The other Seraphs landed around their leader as the Night Lords atop the wall section drew chainsword and blade. A knot of gold amongst the ranks of midnight blue, the Sanguinary Guard carved a bloody path along the gatehouse walls as he struck down the Night Lords, casting the bodies of traitors from the walls with precise blows from their swords and axes. Angels' tears landed with them, unleashing bolts of Volkite fire upon the Night Lords in the courtyard below, driving them back from their defensive positions around the gatehouse. The Stormbird carried onwards, over pressure from its failing shields shattering windows from courtyard buildings. Its final act was one of sacrifice. A volley of missiles and las cannon bursts, spearing into an array of communication towers hidden in the shadows of the keep, silencing the Vox interference. Balite voices and orders replacing the Nostraman chants. Its cargo delivered and duty done, the Stormbird attempted to peel off, but its shields were dead, its hull rent and engines ablaze. Flak fire chased it and tore through layered armour, and the Stormbird plunged downwards, ploughing a furrow amongst the stonework of the courtyard. The efforts of the Sanguinary Guard had drawn away the focus of Crone's forces, and at the gate, Hamonar slammed into the metal doors, tearing them from their mountings. Momentum carried the dreadnought forwards, Hamonar's armoured bulk ploughing into the Night Lords, exchanging fire with the Angel's Tears atop the wall. Traitors were pulped by Hamonar's sweeping fist, and gunned down by the bolters of Crone's warriors that followed the dreadnought through the gate. The few Night Lords that remained gave flight, a fighting retreat, firing bolters at the Blood Angels as the traitors sought the safety of the courtyard's buildings. Crone forbade pursuit, marshalling the warriors by his side to secure the gatehouse against counterattack until reinforced by the reserves that had landed at the base of the causeway. The keep assault. The Blood Angels assembled in the shadow of the gatehouse as the remaining strength of Crone's force made its way into the courtyard of Castrum Velx. Nearly half of Crone's strike force had already been wounded or slain in their assault, and so the Judicia disbanded the most afflicted of squads reconstituting them with reserve elements. Atop the gatehouse wall, Cassiel stood silent, watching legionaries with pitted armour and blooded wounds mustering alongside the unmarred red and gold of their brothers, his serfs scanning the courtyard for signs of a counterattack that did not come. With no foe in sight, Crone ordered his warriors to encircle the keep that stood at the courtyard's centre, a grand bastion in which aspirants of the Ultramarines had once been trained. Only when Crone had mobilized his forces before the bastion's grand entrance did the Sanguinary Guard move to join his assault force, descending from the wall to stand amongst the ranks of the Blood Angels arrayed before the doors. The metal entrance towered over the legionaries, the doors twice their size and engraved with images depicting the Emperor's coming to Macragge, a glorious relief marred by the flayed corpses that hung on chains above it. Breachers locked shields before the entrance, Crone standing with them as Hamana strode forwards, his fist hammering into the plasteel door. Metal buckled, and the dreadnought pulled his arm backwards for a second blow before it could land. Stone and fire engulfed the dreadnought as explosions tore through the door structure. The dreadnought's arm was ripped from its shoulder, its armoured form buried to the waist in rubble, and the barrels of the Contemptor's assault cannon bent and broken. Those Blood Angels closest to the door were pulverized by the shockwave, and Crone was thrown from his feet, protected only by the field of his iron halo. Shrapnel or rubble scythed into the ranks of the Blood Angels arrayed further from the door, breaking bones and tossing legionaries aside. Stone dust filled the air as Blood Angel line officers shouted orders to reform as, from beyond the obscuring threshold, bolter and plasma fire was unleashed, killing legionaries as they moved to push towards the now broken doors, forcing the survivors to scatter in search of cover. The Blood Angels unleashed volleys back into the haze, firing upon the vague outline of foes displayed by helmet targeters, few registering hits, and none of the outlines falling. In small numbers, legionaries pushed forwards, only to be pinned down in the rubble-strewn courtyard by the volleys directed against them. Blood-soaked masonry and the corpses of their brothers, the only cover afforded to them. Atop the threshold's rubble itself, scant meters from his warriors, Crone pushed himself to his knees, his helmet shattered, and his shard axe lost beneath the ruins of the door. Stray fire impacted his armor, but none targeted him directly. Hands reached for him instead, grasping his legs, then dragging him into the keep. Each of Crone's assailants was clad in piecemeal armor, the cobalt blue of the Ultramarines, yet though they wore the panoply of a legionary and matched them in size and strength, their majesty was far diminished. All were helmetless and bore scars on their flesh, while into their skulls had been driven gilded metal wires shaped into the Nostraman sigil for Thrall, inductii of the Night Lords, broken souls fashioned into blunt instruments. The inductii dragged the Judicia through the gunfire, and where one was hit, they showed little sign of pain, their eyes holding only a dead gaze that spoke of great woe and shattered minds. Crone kicked out in an attempt to free himself, but more of the hunched legionaries fell upon him, the pack dragging the Judicia towards the traitor line. As the Judicia disappeared from his view, Cassiel took flight, plunging blindly into the fading haze, and though no order was given, his serfs followed him into the maw of the enemy domain. The gold warriors burst into the grand hall beyond, the once welcoming chamber of marble pillars and finely wrought tiled floors, now occupied by barricades of stone and ceramite. Their arc of flight carried them over the first line of defences and into the midst of the Night Lord's ranks. Their armour-deflecting shots turned against them, cutting their jump pack's propulsion to land amongst the pack of inductii that had dragged Crone deep within. Bursts from Inferno pistols drove the Night Lords round and back, atomizing both flesh and armour when they struck, while the blade of Seraph Tarvelt bisected the inductii that held Crone down. The Golden Warriors formed a ring around the fallen Judicia as he pulled himself to his feet, 8 warriors standing tall in the room's centre, traitors all around them. Judgment. Surrounded by foes on all sides, Crone and the Sanguinary Guard had but a moment to assess the threat and decide on a course of action. At the threshold, the Blood Angels pushed forwards to secure a beachhead, legionaries with flamers unleashing a wall of fire to push back the traitors behind the barricade and create room for Blood Angels to move in. Closer to the Seraph, groups of Night Lords began withdrawing towards the walls, turning their guns from the door to those in their midst. Deeper in the room, near 200 of the Night Lords' inductii gathered at the foot of a dais, their armour a haphazard mix of colours and marks, all bearing the scars of battles they were no doubt scavenged from. Atop the dais stood a throne, the stone chair flanked by a pair of Terminators, the bulky midnight-clad armour contrasting with the pale-skinned Night Lord's legionary who sat upon the throne. The mark of an apothecary was upon the pauldron of the seated legionary, and ident tags registered him as Lancer High of the 8th Legion, a mocking sneer plastered across his unhelmed face. Cassiel looked to Crone for orders, and the Judicia barked forwards in the Baelite battle cant. The knot of red and gold charged towards the throne. A pair of Seraphs moved right and another left, each set charging a group of Night Lords to buy time for their brothers to make for the throne. Their movements lent speed by jump pack bursts. The Seraphs closed with the Night Lords before the traitors could scarcely open fire. Perdition weapons alight, each pair of Seraphs fought shoulder to shoulder, the superior artifice of their blades carving through traitor armour and hewing limbs, their own golden panoply near proof against the blows of chainswords and serrated knives. Yet it was 4 against 24, and soon the Seraphs were encircled by foes that struck from every angle, falling into defensive patterns as they sought now to survive and hold the ground. The first Seraph fell to a chain glaive punched through his side, the second to a spray of point-blank bolter fire that cracked upon his damaged helmet. Then the centre of the Night Lord's line, mere paces from the dueling Seraphs, bowed, then broke open. Volkite fire burned flesh from bone as the Angel's tears pushed through the gap, and the Seraphs were free. The 2 left standing, charging into the mass of Night Lords to hold the breach in the traitor line open. Blood Angels followed the path carved by the Angel's tears, stowing bolt guns and drawing chainswords in a single practiced movement. The roar of motors joined the cacophony of battle that echoed around the hall. As the Blood Angels swarmed over the Night Lord's barricades, Cassiel and his remaining Seraphs, Tervelt and Sanalfon, charged the throne, their jump packs lending them momentum to crash into the mob of inductii with bone-breaking force. The wounded but vengeful Crone paused only to retrieve a weapon before he too charged, the 4 becoming a ruthless storm of blades, axe and spear as they cut their way through the poorly armoured inductii. Each blow found a gap in their piecemeal armour, and though the inductii fought with the vigour of frenzied animals, they could lay no killing blows. Numbers were the sole advantage the inductii held, surrounding the Blood Angels as they forged their way to the throne, the apothecary upon it and the Terminators by his side. The advance slowed as the chain swords of the inductii rained down blow after blow upon the Seraphs, too many for even the most skilled swordsman to turn aside. The armour of their Sanguinary Guard became dented and battered, the gold all but hidden beneath the blood of their foes. For all their numbers, they proved ill-matched against the greater skill of the Seraphs. 10 paces from the throne, the mob of inductii had been broken, a dozen still standing, and the eviscerated remains of the rest carpeting the floor behind the Blood Angels. The few that remained wavered, then broke, scattering towards the rear of the hall as they fled the Seraph's wrath. Atop the throne, the Hansahai had observed the battle with a furrowed brow and the scrutiny of a vivisector dissecting a specimen. As more of his inductii had fallen, he had motioned for the Night Lords at his side to follow him, as he stood and turned away from the battling Seraphs, walking with a mocking lack of haste to the rear of the room. As inductii sprinted past him, he gestured again, and his Terminators turned to meet the Seraphs head-on, while the Hansahai continued walking. Sanalfon was the first to reach the Night Lords, slamming his inferno-wreathed axe deep into the layered armour of a Terminator's shoulder. In response, the Night Lord's warrior's clawed hand lashed out and punched through the Seraph's torso. While the second of the Night Lords gave battle to Crone and Velx, Castiel met his brother's killer, spear raised. It darted out in a flurry of blows. 3 were turned aside by his target's bulky armor, while the 4th bit deep into the broken pauldron, the stench of burning flesh rising as the spear's fire spread into the traitor's wound. The claw of his foe sought the Seraph's blood, but Castiel pivoted backwards. Movement had caught his eye, as at the rear of the room, the Hand Sahai was within arm's length of the door. In a single fluid motion, Castiel hefted his spear and hurled it towards the Hand Sahai. The flaming weapon cut through the air, arcing over the Terminator's shoulder to slam into the apothecary's chest, punching through armor, bone and flesh to impale the traitor into the stone wall behind him. Flame blackened Hand Sahai's armor as he struggled in vain to rip the spear free, but Castiel could spare no more thought as a lightning claw cut into his side, sending the Seraph sprawling to the floor. The Night Lord's Terminator moved to deliver a killing blow, only for a flaming axe to cut through his armored helm. The fallen weapon of Sanalfon, wielded by Crone, the Judicious' own foe already lying dead. Castiel moved to stand, only to be thrown from his feet again as explosions tore through the room. Above, the ceiling began to crumble, and a deluge of rubble rained down upon the grand hall. The throne dais and the area around it were quickly buried beneath rock, with Crone and the Seraphs barely escaping the avalanche of stone. Towards the threshold, Blood Angels and Night Lords alike dove to avoid the mass of falling masonry, pulling back from battle to avoid being crushed. Though the Blood Angels sought to re-engage their foe, the bulk of the Night Lords had already begun to retreat, leaving behind those too wounded to move. The traitors withdrew into corridors that branched off from the hall. Where the Blood Angels sought to follow, explosions tore through the corridors, killing traitor and loyalist alike, as the Night Lords attempted to seal the corridors behind them, no matter the cost. Those left behind were hacked apart by the chainswords of the Blood Angels, with no mercy offered to the traitors. A duty done. In the aftermath of battle, Crone regrouped his warriors, sending strike teams to the catacombs below in search of the bio-vaults they had been dispatched to secure. Some lay open, their gene locks broken and the contents plundered, but most remained untouched. Preloaded encryption engrams unwound the seals, and Blood Angels' apothecaries secured the progenoids for transport to orbit. With his task completed, albeit at the cost of a dreadful butcher's bill, Crone ordered his forces to withdraw from Telazar, passing word to the auxiliary cohort still fighting in Velx City to disengage. The sole delay was afforded to Castiel's wish to dig through the rubble in the throne room. In doing so, they discovered no trace of Lansahai or the spear which had impaled him. Crone refused any notion of pursuit or further delay. Other forces would come to secure Telazar, and to them would fall the task of hunting the traitors that remained. Sanguinary had ordered the gene stock secured and returned to Macragge, not a campaign of conquest and occupation, and so Crone would obey. They left behind a lawless Telazar, the Night Lord's hold upon it broken, but no loyalists' presence to replace them. Months would pass before new fleets would arrive to restore order, yet the canker of the Night Lord's presence had largely been excised, and few of their number left standing. The balance of power in the realm of Ultramar had shifted, albeit incrementally, in the Loyalists' favor. End quote. Now do remember to hit the subscription button if you wish to hear more. Then hit the notifications button, as many of my posts are being somewhat unheralded and unlauded by she who must be obeyed, the dreaded algorithm. And thank you for your precious time, and I hope to see you Friday for more lore. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.